Good morning, everybody, and welcome, and a warm welcome to those who've turned up, and there would have been a warm welcome for those who've probably been told not to turn up. I'm going to hand over in just a second to Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the co-leader of the European and Freedom and Democracy Group, who's very kindly sponsored this meeting today. On my right, I have Professor Bagus. You'll be familiar with his book, which is a fabulous insight into the euro. On my left, I have Professor Hankel. You might be thinking, just a minute, is anybody up here not a professor? Everybody seems to be a professor except myself. I'm a retired financial economist. The difference between me being a professor or not being a professor is I had to be right when I was an economist, otherwise I didn't get paid. If you're a professor, of course, your salary comes up with the rations. I'll hand over to Nigel to introduce our very distinguished speakers.
Well, Godfrey, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And I don't think this conference could possibly have been better timed, given the news and given the ongoing debate. And I'm very pleased that the Parliament didn't decide to ban us from having this event. So, perhaps there is just an element of democracy still left in this institution. I have been, over the last few years, repeatedly asking the question of Mr. Barroso, and in more recent times, of my very good friend, Herman Van Rompuy. And I keep asking the question, what is Plan B? What contingency plan are you putting into place for countries, especially countries like Greece, but more generally, what alternatives are you preparing if this thing goes horribly wrong? And of course, the response is the same every time. They keep telling us there is no Plan B. Now come to the point of view, I actually believe them. I don't think they have got a Plan B, because as we know from the very start, the euro was a political project. It was seen to be that vital step towards creating a United States of Europe, and they didn't think ever, once in their little minds, that anything could possibly go wrong. Well, there are one or two of us in this room who predicted from the very start that this would be a disaster, and indeed this was the issue that got me into politics in the first place, believing that countries as diverse as Greece and Germany could not live and work together inside an economic and monetary union. But now is not the moment for Mr. Bloom or myself to sit here and say, I told you so. That wouldn't achieve anything. Now is the moment for us, as the really good Europeans, and I mean that, because what happens in every country in Europe matters. And I think that democracy is under threat in some of our European countries. Certainly economically, we appear to be on the brink. And so what this conference today is about a constructive engagement, is preparing an argument and looking at alternatives for when inevitably some countries have to leave the Eurozone. And so we're very, very pleased, delighted to have two distinguished speakers to come and join us today to try and kick this debate off. Firstly, Professor Wilhelm Hankel, who I shared a platform with in Berlin last year. He was one of the 4 German professors that took the court case to Karlsruhe, arguing that the bailouts were in fact in direct contravention of the treaties. I'm convinced that you were right. Unfortunately, your court didn't quite say that. I suppose if they had, it would have brought the German government down. But they did win some very significant concessions that, future bailouts would have to go before the German Parliament, and we're delighted to have you here today. And we also have Professor Philipp Bagus, who has written extensively on this subject. He recently published a book, and I think could be described as one of the few people in Europe actually preparing some radical thought on this subject. So, gentlemen, we are absolutely delighted to have you both here today. I'm sure you're going to be met with an absolute barrage of questions when you've finished. I hope the meeting goes well, and I hand you back to the very competent, I'm sure, chairmanship of Godfrey Bloom. Thank you.
Mr. Farage, if you might identify yourselves. We don't need Nigel to identify himself, but if you do have a question, it would be nice if you did.
Thank you, Chairman. This new idea that the bailout fund is going to be geared up with support by the ECB to a sort of 5 times its current size, giving the new bailout fund the firepower of €2 trillion, has been described by former Chancellor Norman Lamont in the British press this morning as nothing but a giant Ponzi scheme. And I'd like to ask our panellists, do they agree with Lord Lamont's view? But in practical terms, can this idea work? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is, we hear senior voices in Germany, right up to the President, being very deeply critical of all that is happening, questioning what is happening to German democracy itself. When are we going to see a political movement in Germany saying much the same thing? I don't at the moment see one.